My name is Sarah Politz. I am an ethnomusicologist and a trombonist. And my book is called Transforming Vodun, Musical Change and Post-Colonial Healing in Benin's Jazz and Brass Band Music. The book traces the transformation of Vodou practice through the history of Benin. It tracks the ways that this musical and religious tradition has knit people together. It's formed their identities. It has enabled them to incorporate the cultures and religious practices of their neighbors. So it has formed culture in times of peace and in times of war, sometimes violently. But it's very important to who the people in southern Benin are. On the one hand, Vodou is the word for divinity or spirit. In the local language, in Fon or in Gung, that is the word for God with a lowercase g. But it also refers more generally to a whole system of cultural and aesthetic practice that includes music and dance and sacrifices and worship and singing, and all of these things together are part of Vodou as a cultural system.
When we say Vodun music, we mean that the culture that was there, the culture, the community that was there, the practices of daily living that was going on before colonialism. The truth is, there was a music before the colonizers came, and that kind of music and that way of life, we call it Vodun music. We call it, Vodun way of life.
Dahomey was founded, we think, sometime in the 1600s. But the people who founded the Empire of Dahomey came from Alada, which is the ancestral kingdom that all the people in southern Benin kind of point to as their ancestral home. Dahomey starts to gradually gain power and starts to develop ambitions. They are at war with the Yoruba in the Oyo Empire, and this is actually the origin of many of the slaves who were sold to Europeans. They were captured in war. And so the slave trade was active in the region. Dahomey at one point conquers Ouida and takes over that kingdom, and so they control the coast, and they're able to bring the captives that they've sold to the port. And thus begins sort of the mass export of slaves. Because Dahomey conquered Ouida, that meant that all of the different cultures that Dahomey had already integrated into its religious system, from interacting with Oyo and the Gung in Hogbonu, they were brought to Ouida and combined with the cultures that were already there. So everything that you have in the pantheon of Vodou, in the religious and the musical practices in Dahomey, you have the same thing in Ouida plus more. And it is that kind of cross-pollination of different divinities from different ethnicities and different, places within kind of this little neighborhood that crosses the Togolese border and the Nigerian border. It's that interplay that makes it like this is a real center for kind of religious flourishing.
It started with Dahomey. Dahomey was the kingdom where the whole thing, sprouted from. And they started, gaining more lands and all of that. But it is that place where, so many ethnic groups have come together. But in Benin, and I can say that this is one of the positive side of ethnic groups, coming together either by force or by, I don't know, positively or negatively, it doesn't matter. But, so many ethnic groups were bound to come together there. So it made Benin a point, a crossroad of rhythms.
Vodou was really central to the Dahomean Empire in the way that they created a kind of proto-national identity. They were knitting together all these different cultures and different religions from the places that they had conquered or interacted with. So Vodou became a kind of state religion, actually, that in order to join this community, in a sense, one's deities had to be assimilated into the system. So that, there's a very close link between Vodou as a spiritual system and the royal family. Dahomey became a French colony in 1897, which is very, very late. You have other, places in the French West African Empire being colonized maybe 10, 20, 30 years before that. And part of the reason that it was colonized so late is the French were really afraid of the Empire of Dahomey because they were such fierce fighters. And they had also a very strategic position, being inland from the coast. And there are many places in Benin that really stayed holdouts against Christian missionization and colonialism for a long time. Abomey has that reputation that even after French colonization, they were extremely resistant to converting to Christianity. And in other places like Ouida and Port Novo, the resistance took on the form of syncretism, where instead of, with conversion to Christianity, leaving these African traditions behind, it seemed logical to people in those places to blend things together. The missionary project was definitely a part of what the French wanted from colonization, and converting Africans to Catholicism in this case was seen as a very important part of creating these modern subjects who would not believe in Vodou, who would not be superstitious as they thought. Vodou practice was heavily regulated under colonization. It might be restricted in, what time of year people could hold ceremonies, or they might need a permit, these various ways that the authorities could kind of keep their hands in things to make sure that they could control them if they wanted to. There's evidence in the police archives of Vodou priests being arrested and refusing to be conscripted and imprisoned. But in terms of everyday practice, where you see the regulations is not necessarily to say, you can never have these ceremonies, but to say you can only have them during these months of the year. And you must apply for a permit, and you must pay for the permit. And, it cannot have this kind of music at this time of day. But probably the most dramatic way that I think colonization impacted the way people think about Vodou in Benin is through education. Because it was, not allowed to speak local languages at school. You had to speak French. You could be rapped across the knuckles or worse for speaking Fon or Goun in school. And then, if you were to dance or make music that was associated with Vodou, you would be very strongly punished and shamed, I think, is really the key thing. And so one of the sad outcomes of French colonization is the creation of these class binaries in Benin, where you have an educated class that ascribes to French ideals of language and dress and art and aesthetics, and anyone who doesn't ascribe to that or continues to, practice Vodou or do things in a traditional way, speak traditional languages, is often seen as less than. And that is one of the inheritances of colonization, even after independence.
I was brought up by parents who were in Vodou. Okay? But we were brought up Christians. Now, our dad was a percussionist, composer, singer. Our mom was a singer, composer. So, can you imagine? It's not because they're converted that, everything changed. No. What kind of music were we playing at that time? We were playing Vodun music. Now, when we say Vodun, I mean, the way it will sound to Americans is not the same way it will sound to my fellow Beninese. When we say Vodun music, right there is like, that music that they play in the convent and nobody hears about it when they're doing sacrifices or when they're doing, atrocities. No, that has nothing to do with that. When we say Vodun music, we mean that the culture that was there, the culture, the community that was there, the practices of daily practices, daily living that was going on before colonialism. And that kind of music and that way of life, we call it Vodun music. We call it, Vodun way of life. Because that was the name that we can give to it to separate it from the thing that they brought. So when we're talking about music now, you can understand that. No, yes, I can sing Gregorian or music or whatever, but there was something before that.
So Benin received its independence from France in 1960. Benin was thrilled to have their independence, but not quite ready to put, nationalist systems of government in place. And they didn't yet have a vision for national music or national art the way that Mali or Senegal or Ghana did. And it took them, another several decades, including changes in leadership, coups, a period of Marxist-Leninism, to really come around and identify what they wanted to be the national image. So during this time in the 70s and 80s, when all these political changes are taking place, this is the socialist period in Benin for the most part, there are also musicians who are getting involved with modernizing Vodou music. Even though Carahou's regime was not an advocate of Vodou, he was actually anti-religious across the board, anti-Christian, anti-Muslim, anti-Vodou. His socialist regime was a secular one. But you have musicians like Sagbo and Danielu, who starts modernizing Kaka music, blending it with jazz and with funk. You have Orchestra Polyrhythmo, which did have Carahou's very strong support, coming out with funk versions of Vodou rhythms. They were paying attention to Fela Kuti and bringing in, Afrobeat and these kind of sounds and blending them with Vodou rhythms. But they would call it something else. They'd call it Sato when it was a traditional Vodou rhythm so that they wouldn't catch anyone's attention. But this project is going on at the same time that the government is saying, we are not supporting Vodou. All the musicians are starting this very interesting project of what are we going to sound like? And what is our musical relationship to Vodou going to be, given that we've had this history of suppression and now we're independent? Well, what does that sound like? So even without being able to say it, or even to practice publicly sometimes, those changes happen in the music. The 1990s was a really interesting period in Benin because you have the end of the socialist regime in 1990 and the beginning of democracy, the rewriting of the constitution to include 3 official religions, Christianity, Islam, and Vodou. And President Soglo in 1992 establishes this annual holiday on January 10th, La Fête de Vodun. This was a real turning point, almost a 180 in some ways in terms of Benin's position on Vodou, that instead of being something that was suspect as part of religious activity under Carahou, who wanted a secular state, now we have Vodou in a neoliberal context where this is a commodity. This is something valuable that can bring tourists to Benin, that can, in so doing, reunite Benin with parts of the African diaspora, especially those that still practice Vodou in Haiti, Brazil, Cuba, New Orleans. And this was a real, moment of revelation, I think. The festival in Ouida in 1993. Really, Soglo putting the full force of the state behind this idea that Vodou is national culture, and that there should be, efforts made to make this product available. This is kind of the calling card for Benin now.
He's like, well, for a long time, our culture, our indigenous, religions have been suppressed. And we all know the story. People came from another place and they like, okay, this is not good and da 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 da. Now we have to reopen our culture to the world. Nicéphore Soglo established the 10th of January as Vodun Celebration Day.
The festival in Ouida has always been a site of reconciliation with the diaspora. And that's what the door of no return and then the door of return are there to symbolize on the beach. And so, yes, the festival is about, bringing tourist traffic to Benin, but it's about connecting in a very real way with other Vodou practitioners around the world.
Donc, les statues de Vodou à l'époque, c'était un peu, comment dire, c'était pas nombreux en fait, c'était pas nombreux. Mais aujourd'hui, parce que tu sais, à l'époque, quand on dit Vodou, beaucoup de gens fuient.
Voilà.
Beaucoup de gens fuient. Mais aujourd'hui, on a compris que, en fait, Vodou n'est pas une mauvaise chose. C'est notre chose, c'est notre identité.
I first went to Benin in 2007. I was pursuing this project that I had designed about interviewing African jazz musicians about their views on the African diaspora. In Benin, there's this unique, I think, local tradition that they call fanfare. We would call them brass bands in English. But they're these local street bands, usually based in a particular church congregation. They often grow out of church choirs. They often include bass drum and snare drum, but playing local rhythms, and then trumpets and trombones and saxophones and this kind of thing. And there's some overlap between these church fanfares and the police orchestra in Porto Novo, which is a really important institution. That's how most of the members of Gangbe learned to play their instruments, is in these local fanfares. They might have studied with somebody in the police band to, hone their craft a little bit, but it started off as something they did for fun. It was a community activity.
Je fais partie quand même des premières, je dirais ça, des deux premières fanfares du Bénin. Parce que cette fanfare-là, aujourd'hui, doit avoir 50 ans ou 55 ans aujourd'hui. Et ils sont encore vivants. C'est
quelle fanfare?
C'est le fanfare Imole Christi.
Ah, je les ai vus. Ouais.
Ça fait partie de la fanfare de mon église. Donc, celui qui m'a appris la trompette vient de là. Chérubin Séraphin, qui a été créé par un Nigérian à l'époque. Donc, cette fanfare vit encore jusqu'à aujourd'hui et c'est ma fierté de toujours d'être en contact avec les membres actuels de cette fanfare. Donc, au départ, c'est les chansons de l'église, c'est les chansons, des cantiques de l'église qu'on jouait. Mais à un moment donné, quand je dirais j'avais eu l'idée, quand je dis j'avais eu l'idée, il n'y a pas que moi, de créer Gangbe Brass Band. Et je les ai fait appel. Je dis, venez, nous allons travailler ensemble. Parce que j'ai eu une autre vision.
They got together and started to, kind of understand a little bit more the potential. Actually, I think it was the influence of Rebirth Brass Band from New Orleans coming to Cotonou that may have really inspired their thinking in this way. But they started to think of themselves as something that was more international and more professional than a fanfare. And this idea of the group that plays jazz and improvises and does pop covers of, a wider range of songs that are more difficult to arrange, and has international ambitions, that's a brass band.
On a été là-bas, j'ai dit, waouh, ça m'a donné envie vraiment d'avoir un truc comme ça à la manière traditionnelle. Mais quand je les ai invités, ils n'étaient pas sûrs. Ils n'étaient pas du tout sûrs. Ils disent, bon, ça c'est quoi ça? C'est quoi encore? C'est à partir de là qu'on a eu à former avec d'autres personnes Gangbe Brass Band. Et quand ça a marché, un peu, petit à petit, on a commencé à avoir cette couleur-là dans cette fanfare. On a commencé à travailler et on jouait. Il y avait la basse, il y avait l'accompagnement, il y avait la percussion et ça allait très bien. Petit à petit, cette fanfare a commencé à s'adapter un peu à des morceaux modernes. Et voilà quoi, jusqu'à ce que c'est devenu ce que c'est jusqu'à aujourd'hui.
What I found interesting about groups like Gangbe Brass Band is that they were really aware that they needed to do some autoethnography in order to be able to talk about their project to people, especially outside of Benin. They needed to kind of turn the lens on themselves. And they, for the Vodou rhythms that they were using that came from Ouida, those who were not initiated actually went to Ouida and consulted the chief Vodou priest in Benin and asked, for permission, first of all, to use these rhythms so that, they wouldn't get in spiritual trouble, but also so that they would know the prohibitions that are associated with the rhythms, who can't play them and when you can't play them and when it might be dangerous to use them. And, what kind of states they can inspire in people and how to use them carefully.
Parce que, en fait, la musique, d'abord en général, c'est un esprit. Déjà, la musique traditionnelle, c'est un autre esprit. Quand j'avais commencé à l'église, et je suis rentré dans la musique moderne, quand tu vas souvent à l'église, on dit non, avec l'instrument que tu as joué à l'église, tu ne peux pas prendre cet instrument-là pour aller jouer en ville. Parce que en ville, la musique en ville, tu es en train de jouer pour le diable. Mais chemin faisant, je me suis dit, mais la musique, c'est la musique, tout d'abord. Et aujourd'hui, dans les églises, la façon dont l'église nous avait parvenu, ce n'est pas ça aujourd'hui. Au départ, l'église est venue avec la couleur du blanc. Mais aujourd'hui, les rythmes qui se jouent dans les couvents aujourd'hui se jouent à l'église. Avec les incantations qui se font dans les couvents, ces incantations se font à l'église, mais avec le nom Jésus. Tu vois? Donc, si c'est pas la musique, si je n'étais pas musicien, c'est moi ça. Je n'allais pas comprendre vraiment que, en fait, la musique, c'est la musique. Et quoi qu'en soit l'endroit où il est.
One of the pieces on Gangbe's Go Slow to Lagos album is Musiki. Musiki guérit la maladie. Music heals illness. Music heals worry. And Crispin Patiki sings it, and he goes back and forth between French and Fombe, explaining that, in Beninese culture, music is the medium for healing, and music is called upon at basically every significant occasion. Music is called upon when the heads of state get together. Music is called upon for a wedding. Music is called upon for a funeral, because its powers are needed to make things go the way that they're supposed to go.
We, as Beninese people, we are part of a culture that is part of us. It has nothing to do with Vodun itself, the way we picturing it. And it has nothing to do with gospel or Jesus as we picturing it. It's just a culture, a way of living.
je demande à tout public, à tout musicien qui veulent acquérir beaucoup de connaissances dans le rythme et dans la couleur musicale de venir au Bénin. Je pense bien qu'ils seront satisfaits. Yeah.
Merci pour ça.
Merci, Sarah.